A shadow stalks Whitechapel, unseen but deadly. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Comment where you're listening from. Your voices light the fog. Let's begin. It was upon one of those bitter evenings when London seems less a city than a mood, when the lamps burn like dimmed stars in a sky of smoke and the very air has a taste of iron, that I found myself alone in Baker Street with my thoughts and the crackle of our coal fire for company. Holmes had been out since late afternoon. He had given no hint of his destination, save a vague reference to the sort of errand, my dear Watson, which makes a man grateful for the invention of boots. Then he had slipped away, long coat buttoned high, the collar turned up as if to guard that sensitive, inquisitive face from the prying fingers of the wind. I had, as is my habit, attempted to occupy my mind with my notes, those faithful records which, in calmer hours, have proved the only barrier between my recollection and the chaos of months. Yet my pen hovered, listless. The city beyond our sitting-room window made a most dismal orchestra. The rattle of wheels over damp cobbles, a distant shout swallowed by fog, the occasional mournful whistle of a constable somewhere in the great unseen. Mrs. Hudson had brought in the evening post and, with it, the scent of wet wool from the stairwell. She moved with the careful step of one who has, for some years, learned that the smallest interruption in Baker Street might precipitate the largest commotion. "Any word, sir?" she asked, pausing near the door. Her eyes went, as they always did, to the table where Holmes's chemistry apparatus and a litter of papers made their customary disorder. "None," I answered. "He will return when he is ready." Mrs. Hudson sighed as if that were an entire philosophy, and withdrew. I rose and stood by the window. The fog outside was of that thick yellow kind which does not merely conceal objects, but seems to alter their character. Passing figures became phantoms. A handom's lamps were two floating embers. Even the familiar street corner opposite appeared like a suggestion rather than a certainty. It was while I watched those vague forms drift through the murk that a quick, decisive step sounded upon the stairs. A key turned. The door opened. Holmes entered with the briskness of one who carries the answer to a question which no one else has yet realized is being asked. He had the air of a man who has been both cold and amused by it. His cheeks were touched with color, his eyes brighter than I had seen them all day. He tossed his hat upon the chair, shook rain from his sleeves with the practiced impatience of a soldier returning from the field, and then stood for a moment, looking about him as if the room, too, were a puzzle to be solved. "You have been writing, Watson," he remarked. "I have been attempting it," said I, for my notebook lay open upon the table, and my own handwriting, half a page long, stared up at me in accusation. He crossed and lifted the notebook with that peculiar delicacy which was in strange contrast to his general carelessness about material things. His eyes skimmed the lines. "Attempting," he agreed, with a conscientious restraint which would have delighted your old medical examiners. "You begin with the weather, you proceed to a moral reflection upon the city, and you end, quite properly, by confessing yourself bored. I confess no such thing. Not in so many words. You imply it. The pen drifts. The adjective becomes earnest. The hand pauses every 5 seconds to listen for a footstep which never comes. Also," and here he looked up with a faint smile, "you have spilled ink upon your cuff." I glanced down and found the small, dark stain. Holmes returned my notebook to its place as though he had merely been verifying the date. "You are in high spirits," I observed. "I am in want of occupation," he replied. "High spirits are merely the froth upon that want. When I am idle, I become, as you have noted, intolerable. You have not been idle. You have been out in this weather." Holmes drew his long limbs toward the fire and held his hands to the warmth, fingers spread like the branches of a winter tree. "Yes," said he, "I have been out. And London has been kind enough to show me what London always shows the man who looks, that most people see only what they expect to see. In Whitechapel, for instance, one expects misery and one finds it. In Mayfair, one expects comfort, and one finds that too, though less honestly. At the mention of Whitechapel, I turned, for there was a certain weight to the word upon his tongue. It is the nature of my friend that he will toss out a remark as another man tosses a match. Carelessly, perhaps, yet always with the possibility of fire. "You were in Whitechapel?" I asked. "For a quarter of an hour," he said. "Enough, quite enough." And then, as if the subject were of no more importance than the weather, he took up the violin from its corner, placed it beneath his chin, and drew the bow across the strings in a low, tentative note. No melody, only a sound like a question. I had come to know those moods of his. There are times when Holmes plays not for beauty, but for clarity, as if the vibration of the strings might rearrange the vibrations of his thoughts into some order that spoken conversation cannot reach. He played now for perhaps a minute, and then set the instrument down with decision. "A visitor will arrive," he said. "You have been peering into the fog again." "No, I have been peering into you." He nodded toward my coat, which hung over the back of a chair. "You have not taken it down all evening. You do not do that when you expect to remain undisturbed." "I did not expect a contradiction. Your mind did not expect it. Your habits did." He moved to the mantelpiece and examined a small smear of soot upon the brass with mild disapproval, then wiped it away with a handkerchief. "There will be a knock within 5 minutes." He had scarcely spoken when it came, sharp, brisk, and urgent, as if the hand behind it could not bear to wait. Mrs. Hudson's voice followed. "Mr. Holmes, sir, a gentleman to see you." Holmes's eyes met mine over the fire. "Within 2, he murmured. "You see, Watson, habit is the most honest witness." "Show him up," he called. A moment later, our door opened and a man was ushered in. One of those men whose very attempt at composure advertises a strong internal agitation. He was perhaps 40, neatly dressed, but with the carelessness of one who was dressed under pressure. His tie slightly askew, a glove tucked hastily into his pocket, his hat crushed at the brim. His face was pale, the pale of sleeplessness rather than sickness, and his eyes darted from Holmes to me and back again as if seeking reassurance in the very arrangement of the room. He held himself with the stiff propriety of a clerk or a minor official, someone accustomed to order and hierarchy, and frightened now because order had been broken. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he began, with a slight bow. Holmes indicated the chair nearest the table. "You have found him. Pray sit. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. You are—" "Samuel Hargreaves," said the man quickly. "Samuel Hargreaves of the Metropolitan Police? Though I beg you will not imagine I come as an emissary of Inspector Lestrade. This is not official, at least not yet." Holmes's brows lifted a fraction. "How delightfully ambiguous. That suggests either that you wish to act without your superior's knowledge, or that you fear your superior's incompetence." Hargreaves flushed. "Neither, sir. Or both? I scarcely know. I'm a clerk in the records office at Scotland Yard. I have no authority to command anyone. I am not even—" "A man of action," Holmes finished for him. "No. You are a man of paper. Yet you have come to me in person and in haste, which means that paper has become, how shall I say it, alive." The clerk swallowed. "Yes, sir, that is it exactly." Holmes leaned forward, his long fingers steepled. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face. He seemed at once languid and intensely alert. "Tell me what has frightened you, Mr. Hargreaves. Begin at the point which seems least important to you, for that is usually where the truth hides." Hargreaves glanced toward the window as if expecting the fog itself to press in and listen. "It began with a letter," said he. "2 letters, in fact. Both addressed to the Commissioner, both peculiar." Holmes made a small sound of impatience. "Letters are frequently peculiar. It is how the English express themselves. What was peculiar in these?" "The handwriting, sir," said Hargreaves. "And what was enclosed?" Holmes's eyes sharpened. Enclosed? Hargreaves's hands, which had been twisting his hat, now fumbled within his coat. He produced a small envelope, already opened, and a folded sheet of paper. He laid them upon the table with the reverence of a man placing a dangerous substance before an expert. Holmes did not touch them at once. He merely looked. "Has it been handled?" he asked. "By me," said Hargreaves miserably. "By the messenger who brought it. By the commissioner's secretary. Perhaps by one or two others. I tried to prevent it, but it was too late. They thought it a crank." "Everything important begins as a crank," murmured Holmes, "and ends as a catastrophe, if ignored." He took up the paper with the tips of his fingers as though it might stain him. His eyes moved swiftly over the words. I, too, leaned forward, but he tilted the page slightly away. A small gesture, polite yet firm, which told me that I should not read yet. He read the letter through once, then again. His face remained calm, but there was a change in him, an invisible tightening like a wire being drawn taut. He set the letter down. "And the enclosure?" he asked. Hargreaves swallowed again. "It was inside the envelope, sir. A scrap of cloth, dark, damp, and smelling of lime," said Holmes quietly. Hargreaves stared. "Yes. How did you—" Holmes reached for the envelope, opened it with care, and tipped its contents into his palm. A small piece of fabric slid out. Black wool, torn rather than cut, with one edge ragged as if ripped in haste. Even from where I sat, I caught a faint, acrid odor. Holmes held it up to the light, then to his nose, then to the side of his face as if feeling its texture against his skin. He placed it upon a clean sheet of paper and made a quick note in pencil. "You have brought me one of the letters," said he. "Where is the other?" Hargreaves hesitated. "At the yard, under lock, as best as I could manage." Holmes's gaze flickered. "As best as you could manage? That is not a phrase which inspires confidence." "I am only a clerk," Hargreaves protested. "I begged them to treat it seriously, but they laughed. The commissioner is away in Brighton, and the secretary is a man who believes criminals spell badly," said Holmes with a touch of contempt. "Continue." "The first letter came 3 days ago," Hargreaves went on. "It was delivered by hand to the front desk. No postage, no stamp. The messenger was a boy, perhaps 12, who vanished before anyone thought to question him. The letter was addressed in a precise hand, very neat, almost scholarly. It said that the police were blind, that there was a shadow in Whitechapel, and that there would be a demonstration." Holmes's eyes never left Hargreaves' face. "And did the letter name a victim?" "No, sir. Only a place." "A place?" repeated Holmes. "Which?" Hargreaves' voice dropped. "The old Montague passage." I felt a chill despite the fire. There are parts of London that the mind does not willingly inhabit, and Whitechapel at night is among them. Yet the old Montague passage, narrow, foul, and twisting, had a reputation even among those who knew the East End well. Holmes's expression did not change, but the fingers of his right hand tapped once upon the table. It was a habit of his when some thought, unpleasant yet compelling, presented itself. "And the second letter?" he asked. "It came yesterday," said Hargreaves, "also by hand, also by a boy. This time the handwriting was different, less neat, more theatrical, as though someone were imitating the first hand but could not help showing off. It said that the demonstration had been made, that the police had missed it, and that the next would not be missed." Holmes leaned back. "How very considerate." Hargreaves looked desperate. "Mr. Holmes, there has been a death." "A death in Whitechapel is hardly news," said Holmes. "This one is," Hargreaves insisted, "because of what was done, because of what was left." Holmes's gaze sharpened further, and for the first time that evening I saw in him that particular stillness which precedes action, like the hush before a storm breaks. "Tell me," said he. Hargreaves drew a long breath, and when he spoke his words came in a rush, as if he feared that if he did not expel them quickly they would choke him. A woman was found in the old Montague passage 2 nights ago. Not a streetwalker, sir, at least not by the clothes. There were no obvious signs of struggle. She was arranged, set against the wall. Her hands were clean, her nails trimmed. She wore a ring. Yet her throat? Her throat was cut, Mr. Holmes, and there was a mark upon her wrist as if a cord had bound her. Holmes's eyes flickered once to the scrap of cloth on the table and back again. And what was left? He asked. Hargreaves's face was grey now. He reached again into his coat and produced a small object wrapped in paper. He set it down, hesitated, and then unfolded it. It was a key. Not a simple house key, but one of those larger iron keys used for office locks or cellar doors. Upon its bow, its round head, someone had scratched a symbol, 3 parallel lines, crossed by a single diagonal stroke, like a crude shadow cast over a fence. Holmes's fingers hovered above it, but did not touch. "And this was found where?" he asked. "In her mouth," whispered Hargreaves. I confess that I started. There was something in that detail, something not merely cruel but deliberate and theatrical, which made my stomach tighten. Holmes, however, remained composed. He studied the key, not as a horror, but as a sentence to be passed. "Who found her?" he asked. "A constable on patrol. He called for help. Inspector Lestrade attended, along with the divisional surgeon. The body was taken to the mortuary. The key was removed and handed over." "And why have I not heard of this in the papers?" Hargreaves gave a bitter laugh. "Because the secretary persuaded the surgeon to report it as an ordinary East End murder, and Lestrade has been busy." Holmes's lip curled. "Busy hunting a drunk with a knife, no doubt, because that is something one can show in a report." "It is not that," said Hargreaves quickly. "There is another case, one of those society scandals. A baronet's son, a missing necklace. Lestrade is assigned." Holmes's eyes met mine for a moment, and in that glance I read his opinion of the Yard's priorities. "And you," said Holmes, turning back to Hargreaves, "as a clerk in the records office, have decided that this death is not ordinary, and that it is connected to these letters." "Yes," said Hargreaves with sudden passion, "because I saw the reports, because I saw the handwriting, because I have seen that symbol before, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's posture altered. He leaned forward again, every line of him attentive. "Where?" he asked softly. "In a file," said Hargreaves. "An old file. 7 years ago. A series of burglaries in Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Shopkeepers, small warehouses, places with cellars. No violence, only theft. The thief was never caught. But at each scene a mark was found, scratched on a doorpost or a lock. 3 lines and a diagonal stroke. The constables called it the shadow mark because it looked like bars in moonlight. Holmes's eyes had become very bright. He sat as still as a statue. "And in those burglaries," he said, "what was taken?" "Not always the same thing," said Hargreaves. "Sometimes money, sometimes paper, sometimes nothing of value at all, but there was one thing, one pattern." Holmes waited. One could almost hear the fog pressing against the glass. "They always entered by a door that had a new lock," said Hargreaves, "a lock that had been fitted within the last fortnight, and the lock was always ruined. Not forced, not picked, ruined as if something had been poured into it." Holmes's fingers tapped the table again, once, twice, then stopped. "A corrosive," he murmured. "Quicklime, perhaps, or something akin." Hargreaves nodded vigorously. "Yes, sir. The locksmith said so. They could not understand it. And now there is this cloth that smells of lime and a woman murdered with that mark upon the key." Holmes rose abruptly, so abruptly that I, too, stood, for in our rooms one learns to respond to the motion of his mind as much as to his words. "You did well to come," he said. "Whatever else you may be, Mr. Hargreaves, you possess the rarest of virtues at Scotland Yard. You can read." Hargreaves blinked as if unsure whether he had been praised or insulted. Holmes moved to the shelf where he kept his monographs, those curious pamphlets and notebooks in which he had collected the fruits of his experience, ash analyses, footprints, handwriting, the peculiarities of poisons, and the 100 other subjects which he had made his own. He ran his finger along the spines until he found a small, thin volume. "On the use of lime in criminal practices," he read aloud. "It is an essay I wrote in a moment of optimism, which I have since regretted. It appears I must now prove myself right." He took the book, opened it, and then closed it again as if he had merely been reminding himself of its existence. "Watson," said he, "your coat." "I am ready," I replied, though I confess I would gladly have exchanged readiness for the comfort of the fire. Holmes turned to Hargreaves. "You will accompany us." Hargreaves half rose. "To Whitechapel?" "To the mortuary first," said Holmes, "then to the old Montague passage, then, if we are fortunate, or unfortunate, depending upon one's taste, to wherever this shadow chooses to fall next." Hargreaves' lips parted as if he wished to protest, but some expression in Holmes's face silenced him. It was not sternness, so much as certainty. Holmes was already in the case, and once he entered a mystery, the world seemed to rearrange itself around his purpose. As we descended the stairs, Mrs. Hudson called after us anxiously, but Holmes, already drawing on his gloves, only waved a hand. The street received us with a breath like cold, damp cloth. The fog had thickened. The gas lamps were halos without bodies. Somewhere, a bell tolled the hour with a sound muffled by vapor. Holmes paused at the foot of the steps and looked up and down Baker Street as though reading the city's pulse in its emptiness. A hansom materialized out of the yellow, its horse's hooves striking sparks from the stones. Holmes hailed it, and we climbed within. As the cab moved off, the familiar outline of our home vanished behind us like a memory. Inside the carriage, Hargreaves sat rigidly, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Holmes, on the other hand, was silent in that way of his which is never empty. I watched his profile in the dim light. His eyes were fixed not on the road, but on something internal. A chain of reasoning, perhaps, already uncoiling. At last he spoke, and his voice was so quiet that we both leaned nearer. "This is not a common murderer," said he, "not even a common madman. He is sending messages, he is staging symbols, he is forcing the police to look where they do not wish to look." Hargreaves' voice trembled. "What do you think he wants?" Holmes's thin smile showed for an instant. "Attention," said he. "And a key." I stared. A key? Holmes's gaze remained forward, as if he could see through fog and brick and time itself. "The key in the woman's mouth," he said. "It was not placed there only for shock. It is an invitation, Watson, or a warning. The question is, to what door does it belong?" The cab wheels splashed through a puddle. Somewhere close by, a drunkard laughed and then coughed. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Holmes's fingers, resting on his knee, traced an invisible pattern, 3 lines, crossed by a diagonal stroke. "The shadow over Whitechapel," he murmured. "Let us see what casts it." And with that, the carriage plunged deeper into the fog, bearing us toward the East End, and the first dark turn of a case which, as I now write these lines, I can scarcely bring myself to remember without a renewed sense of that cold London air and the peculiar dread that sometimes accompanies the beginnings of truth. The cab's hood rattled like a loose lid upon a coffin as we turned from the broader streets into those narrower arteries which lead toward the river and the East End. The very air seemed to thicken as we went, and with it the feeling, unpleasant and yet compelling, that we were passing from the orderly surface of London into some darker underlayer where other laws prevailed. Holmes remained silent. Once, when the horse shied at a sudden figure crossing the road, I saw him lean forward and peer through the little glass pane with an intensity that told me his mind had not been idle for an instant. Hargreaves sat opposite, rigid as a man awaiting sentence. I confess that I, too, felt a certain oppression, though I have been under fire in lands where death comes more frankly than it does in London's alleys. Here there was something worse than danger. There was secrecy, the sense of an intelligence at work which wished to be unseen. At last, the cab drew up before a grim building whose windows glimmered faintly behind curtains of steam. A lantern burned above the entrance, and its light fell upon wet stone and a constable's helmet. The man on duty, recognizing Holmes in spite of the fog, straightened at once. "Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed, "we weren't told you were coming." "That is because I did not ask permission," said Holmes, stepping past him with that calm assurance which has more than once opened doors that should have been closed. "The surgeon is within." "In the examination room, sir," the constable answered, glancing uneasily at Hargreaves as if unsure whether he ought to be admitted. Holmes noticed the hesitation and swept it aside with a look. "This gentleman is from the yard. We are expected." It was a small lie, delivered with such naturalness that it became, for all practical purposes, the truth. We were admitted at once and led down a corridor which smelled of carbolic and damp stone. Somewhere behind a door I heard the clink of instruments and the low murmur of voices. The surgeon, a thin, precise man with tired eyes, looked up as we entered. His expression was that of one who has been interrupted in an unpleasant duty, and yet it softened when he saw Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "you are late." "Then death has been punctual," Holmes returned. "You have the body still?" The surgeon nodded curtly. "It was brought in yesterday morning. Lestrade came and went. There was a great deal of fuss over the object." "The key," said Holmes. "Where is it now?" The surgeon's mouth tightened. "In an evidence box, locked in my cabinet, pending instructions. I do not like such things in the mortuary, Mr. Holmes. They bring, how shall I put it, a sensation." Holmes's eyes were already traveling. They took in the surgeon's ink-stained fingers, the smear of chalk upon his sleeve, the particular arrangement of bottles upon the shelf. His gaze went last to a closed door at the far end. "The sensation," said he mildly, "comes not from the object but from the mind which placed it. May we see her?" The surgeon hesitated only long enough to satisfy his dignity, then pulled on a pair of gloves and opened the door. A wave of colder air met us. The room beyond was lit by a single overhead lamp, harsh and white. A metal table stood in the center, and upon it, under a sheet, lay the quiet outline of a human form. Hargreaves made a small sound in his throat. He gripped the doorframe for a moment, then forced himself forward. Holmes, however, approached the table as he would approach any problem, without horror, without pity, but with an unwavering attention that seemed almost reverent in its own peculiar way. The surgeon drew back the sheet. The woman was young, no more than 25, I should judge, with a pale face and dark hair smoothed back from her brow. There was, even in death, a certain refinement to her features, the curve of the mouth, the delicate nose, the fine arch of the eyebrow. Her eyes were closed. Her lips, though slightly parted, had been arranged with care, as if someone had wished her to appear merely asleep. But the throat told another story. There was a deep cut, clean and decisive, and the skin about it was bruised in a way I recognized all too well. Her right wrist bore the mark Hargreaves had spoken of, a narrow, angry line encircling it, as though cord or wire had been drawn tight. Holmes did not look first at the wound. He looked at the hands. "Clean," he murmured. "No ingrained dirt, no needle marks, nails trimmed. A working woman with leisure, or a lady with misfortune." He lifted one hand gently. turning it so that the light fell upon the palm. Then he bent and examined the fingers, the knuckles, the thin line where a ring had sat. "She wore it often," said he. "The mark is deep. It was removed not long ago, after death, I think." The surgeon stirred. "We found no ring." "No," said Holmes. "That is why you did not mention it, yet the absence is more eloquent than the presence." He moved then to the hair, lifting a dark strand between thumb and forefinger. His eyes narrowed. "Watson," he said softly, without looking up, "do you observe anything?" I bent closer. "Her hair is damp." Holmes's glance flickered to mine, approving and then back to the corpse. "Damp," said he, "and yet she has been here, in this dry room, for more than a day. That suggests that it was damp at the time she arrived, and that something in it resists drying." He leaned nearer and inhaled once, delicately, as if sampling wine. "Lime," he said. "Faint, but there." Hargreaves' face was tight. "The cloth matches the odor," Holmes finished. "Yes." He looked up to the surgeon. "Was she washed?" The surgeon frowned. "No, we do not wash them unless—" "Then the dampness is part of the case," said Holmes. He straightened and, for the first time, allowed his eyes to rest upon the throat. The cut was clean. Too clean. This was done with a very sharp blade, I observed, professional habit overcoming my discomfort. Holmes nodded. And by a hand that did not tremble. Not a street quarrel. Not a drunkard. He glanced at the wrist again, and his gaze sharpened. "Show me the cord, Mark," he said. The surgeon lifted the woman's arm. Holmes traced the line with a finger so light it scarcely touched. "Not rope," he murmured. "Too narrow. Not silk cord. Too rough. Wire, perhaps. Thin wire with a slight twist." He released the arm. For a moment he stood utterly still, and I knew that he was arranging these observations within his mind like pieces of a mechanical puzzle. "Now the key," said he. The surgeon crossed to a cabinet, unlocked it, and produced a small evidence box. Within, on cotton wool, lay the iron key. The scratched symbol was plain. Holmes did not touch it yet. He took out his lens and examined the markings. "Not scratched with a knife," he said, "with a file or a hardened point. The hand is careful. The angle of the diagonal stroke is consistent, meaning the person has made it many times." Hargreaves whispered. "The old burglaries." Holmes held up a finger, silencing him without impatience. His attention had shifted to something else, the key's shaft, the grooves of its bit, the minute deposits at its edges. He looked up suddenly. "Surgeon, what was in her mouth besides the key?" The surgeon blinked. "Nothing. There was saliva, of course. A little blood." Holmes's eyes did not leave the key. "You are certain there was no grit? No powder?" The surgeon's expression changed. "There was a faint residue. We wiped it away when we removed the key." Holmes's jaw tightened, an unusual sign of irritation in him. "You wiped it away," he repeated softly. There was no instruction," the surgeon protested. "Lestrade said—" Holmes waved it aside, but I saw that his mind had already made note of the loss. "No matter," he said. "The residue is here." He took a clean piece of paper, tipped the key gently, and with the corner of his handkerchief scraped at the grooves. A faint pale dust fell upon the paper. He brought it to the lamp and studied it, then touched a finger to it and rubbed it between thumb and forefinger. "Not chalk," he said. "Not plaster. Lime, yes. But mixed with something. It has a slight tack." He sniffed again, then his eyes lifted, distant. "Oil," he said. "Lime and oil." Hargreaves stared. "What does that mean?" Holmes at last looked at him fully, and his gaze was like a blade. "It means," said he, "that someone wished that key to be both a message and a tool. Lime to eat away at metal. Oil to carry it into the lock, a corrosive paste, applied deliberately. He set the key down with care and turned, suddenly decisive. "Where is the report of the scene?" he asked. Hargreaves fumbled in his coat and produced folded papers. Holmes took them and read with rapidity, his eyes darting, absorbing. I watched his face for some sign of conclusion, but it was as unreadable as ever. Only once did his brows lift, and that at a line I could not see. He handed the papers back. "We go to the passage," said he. "And you, Mr. Hargreaves, will tell me everything you know of those old burglaries. Names, dates, any odd detail that seemed too trivial to record. Particularly the locks. Particularly the locksmith." Hargreaves nodded, pale but obedient. As we turned to leave, Holmes paused by the door and glanced back at the dead woman one last time. "She was not meant to be anonymous," he said quietly. "Someone wants her known, yet the papers were kept silent." Interesting. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mortuary's cold. "Why should that matter?" Holmes's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Because secrecy, Watson, is not always the ally of the criminal. Sometimes it is his enemy, and if our man has gone to the trouble of symbols and letters, he did not do so in order to be ignored. He pulled on his gloves with brisk precision, which means," he added, "that he will correct that mistake." The fog had thinned a little by the time we returned to the street, though it clung still to the ground like some reluctant creature unwilling to abandon its hold upon the city. The cabman, who had waited with the patience of one accustomed to strange errands, flicked his reins as we climbed in again, and the horse set off at a cautious pace toward Whitechapel. Holmes spoke little during the drive, but his silence was of a different quality now, no longer exploratory, but deliberate, as though each fact had been fitted into its place, and he was testing the structure by walking around it. Hargreaves, prompted by a slight inclination of Holmes's head, began to recount what he knew of the old burglaries. Dates carefully recalled, locations traced upon an invisible map, names of shopkeepers and warehouse owners who had complained more of ruined locks than of missing goods. "They called him methodical," Hargreaves said. "Too methodical for a common thief. He never took more than he needed, and sometimes he took nothing at all. There was talk that he was after documents, ledgers, contracts, but nothing was ever proven." "And the locksmiths?" Holmes asked. "There were 3 men called in repeatedly," Hargreaves replied. "One retired. One moved north. The 3rd, Samuel Pritchard, still works in Spitalfields." Holmes's eyes opened a fraction more. "Still," he repeated. "That is useful." The cab slowed, then stopped. We had reached the edge of the old Montague passage. Even by day it is a wretched place. By night and under fog, it seemed less a street than a narrow wound cut into the city. The buildings leaned inward as if conspiring. Refuse lay in heaps. Somewhere water dripped steadily, with a sound like measured breathing. A constable stood at the entrance, stamping his feet for warmth. He stiffened when he saw Holmes. "Evening, sir." "Good evening," Holmes returned. "Nothing disturbed since the incident?" "No, sir. Orders were to keep folk out." Holmes nodded approval and stepped past him. I followed, acutely conscious of how the sound of our boots echoed between the walls. The passage was scarcely wide enough for 2 men abreast. The gas lamp at the far end burned weakly, casting distorted shadows that seemed to shift as we moved. Holmes halted precisely where the body had been found. He crouched at once, his long coat brushing the filthy stones, and began to examine the ground with the care of a jeweler studying a floor. "Watson," he said, "the lamp." I held it low, and its light revealed what the fog and darkness concealed. Faint scuff marks near the wall, a darker stain upon the stones, and, near a rusted drain, a thin white residue clinging stubbornly to the damp. Holmes touched it with his cane tip. "There," said he. "The same paste. Lime and oil. It was prepared here. For what purpose? I asked. To soften metal, he replied. Or to destroy it. He rose and examined the wall itself. There, half hidden by grime, was the mark. 3 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal slash, scratched deeply into the brick. The shadow, Hargreaves breathed. Yes, said Holmes, and freshly made. The edges are sharp. He wished it seen. Holmes stepped back, surveying the passage as a whole. His gaze traveled upward, from the stones to the doors and windows that overlooked the narrow way. Note the height of the mark, he said. Placed at eye level. Not hurried. Not concealed. You think he wanted the police to find it, I said. I think, Holmes replied, that he wanted someone else to find it first, and that the police were merely incidental. He turned suddenly toward a nearby door, a cellar entrance, its lock hanging at an odd angle. He knelt again, testing it with a practiced hand. Ruined, he murmured. Not forced, dissolved. He straightened, eyes alight now with that fierce satisfaction which always came when the threads of a case began to draw together. Our man returned to old habits, he said, but with a variation. 7 years ago he destroyed locks to enter quietly. Now he destroys them to send a message. And the woman? I asked. Holmes's expression sobered. She was part of the message, either as a warning or as a proof. A proof of what? That he has progressed, Holmes answered. That he is no longer content with doors. At that moment, footsteps sounded at the far end of the passage. A figure approached, hesitant, curious. The constable called out sharply, and the man stopped. Holmes did not turn. His attention was fixed upon the ruined lock, his mind clearly racing ahead. Watson, he said quietly, our adversary has patience, preparation, and a grievance that has survived 7 years. He understands symbols, chemistry, and the habits of the police. He chooses Whitechapel because it hides him and because it reminds him of something. He stood at last and brushed his hands together. And now, he added, he has announced himself, which means he will not stop. The fog stirred, shifting the shadows upon the walls. Somewhere deeper in the east end, a bell rang, a solitary note that seemed, in that narrow passage, less like a measure of time than a warning. We left the passage as we had entered it, with the uneasy sense that its narrow walls had observed us in return. The constable resumed his vigil, though I noted that his eyes followed Holmes with a mixture of relief and apprehension, as if he were glad to see responsibility passed to another, and yet fearful of what that other might uncover. The cab was dismissed. Holmes preferred to walk. Whitechapel at that hour was not wholly asleep. From behind shuttered windows came the murmur of voices, a cough, a snatch of laughter that died as quickly as it arose. The street lamps burned low, their glass dulled by grime, so that each cast only a small island of light amid a sea of shadow. Holmes walked with long, measured strides, his head slightly bowed, his gaze ranging from the pavement to the doors and back again. Hargreaves kept close, anxious to supply any fact that might prove useful, while I fell a step behind, content to observe both the streets and my friend. After a few minutes, Holmes stopped abruptly before a narrow shop front. Its sign, barely legible, proclaimed S. Pritchard, locksmith and bell hanger. The shutters were up, but a faint light glimmered through a gap at the bottom. Still at work, Holmes observed, or at least pretending to be. Hargreaves stiffened. Pritchard, sir. He's a quiet man. Been here 20 years. So much the better, said Holmes. Quiet men have time to think. He knocked, not loudly, but with a particular rhythm that suggested neither official business nor casual custom. There was a pause. Then the shutters rattled and a narrow opening appeared. Yes, said a wary voice. Mr. Pritchard, Holmes replied calmly, we require a word on a matter of locks. The shutters lifted a little more. A thin face appeared, lined and pale, with eyes that darted first to Holmes, then to Hargreaves, lingering there with unmistakable recognition. "I've done nothing wrong," said the locksmith quickly. "No one has accused you," Holmes returned. "Yet." That single word had its effect. The shutters were raised, the door unbolted, and we stepped into a cramped shop cluttered with keys, springs, and tools. The smell of metal and oil hung thick in the air. Pritchard wiped his hands on a rag, his movements nervous. "If this is about the old business—" "It is," said Holmes, "and about a new one." The locksmith's eyes flicked toward the back of the shop, where a narrow stair led downward. "You were called to several burglaries 7 years ago," Holmes continued. "Locks ruined by a corrosive compound. You gave your opinion at the time. That they'd been destroyed." "Not picked," Pritchard said. Which was true. "And now," Holmes said softly, "you have been called again, though not officially. Tonight." Pritchard's mouth opened, then closed. His silence was answer enough. Holmes leaned forward, his voice low and precise. "You were summoned to the old Montague passage this evening to look at a cellar lock." Pritchard sagged slightly. "A boy came, paid me in advance, said it was urgent." "What did you find?" Holmes asked. "That the lock was eaten through," Pritchard whispered. "Same as before. Lime and oil, same damned mixture." "And the mark?" Holmes said. The locksmith swallowed. It was there. Holmes straightened. "Did the boy say anything?" Pritchard hesitated, then nodded. He said, "To tell the man with the sharp face that the door would not be the last." Holmes's eyes flashed. "He knows me," he murmured. He turned to Hargreaves. "That is why the letters came. Our man believes himself in dialogue, not with the police, but with me." A sudden sharp knock fell upon the shop door, making us all start. Holmes's hand went instinctively to his coat. Another knock followed, louder, more insistent. Holmes smiled thinly. "You see, Watson, he does not care to be ignored." The knock came again, then a voice, muffled by the wood. "Message for Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes raised a hand, signaling silence, and with the other made a subtle motion to Pritchard, who retreated instinctively toward the back of his shop. Hargreaves stood frozen, his eyes fixed upon the door as though he expected it to burst inward of its own accord. I confessed that my own pulse had quickened. There was something unnerving in the calm assurance of that voice beyond the threshold. Holmes crossed the narrow space with the unhurried tread of a man who has already weighed the risks and found them acceptable. He drew the door open a few inches. A boy stood outside, no more than 13, his cap pulled low, his coat far too thin for the night. He held an envelope between two grimy fingers and looked up with the boldness of youth that does not yet understand fear. "For you, sir," he said. "I was told to give it into your own hand." Holmes examined him closely. "And who told you?" The boy shrugged. "A gent. Paid me a shilling." "Describe him." "Tall," said the boy after a moment's thought. "Quiet. Wore gloves. Smelled funny, like cleaning stuff." Holmes's lips curved faintly. He took the envelope. "That will do. You may go." The boy lingered, curiosity warring with caution, then turned and vanished down the street, swallowed almost at once by the fog. Holmes closed the door and stood for a moment regarding the envelope as if it were a living thing. It was unsealed. Upon the front was written his name in a firm, deliberate hand. He opened it and withdrew a single sheet of paper. I watched his face as he read. There was no start, no sign of surprise, only a tightening about the eyes and that familiar look of cold interest. "Well?" I asked. He handed me the paper. It contained only a few lines. "You have found the door, Mr. Holmes. You have smelled the key. The next lock will not yield so easily. Come alone if you wish to understand." Beneath was the mark, 3 lines crossed by a diagonal stroke. Hargreaves read it over my shoulder and made an involuntary sound. "He's daring you." Holmes nodded. "Naturally." "And the police?" Hargreaves pressed. "Lestrade?" "Will be informed," Holmes said dryly. "Which means he will arrive late and look in the wrong direction." He turned back to Pritchard. "Did the man mention a place?" The locksmith shook his head. "Only that I'd hear of it." Holmes folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. "You have been very helpful, Mr. Pritchard. You will say nothing of this visit." The locksmith needed no persuasion. We stepped out into the street once more. The fog had thickened again, closing around us like a curtain drawn with deliberate intent. Holmes paused beneath the lamp, his face half in shadow, half in yellow light. "He wants me alone," he said quietly. "And you will not go?" I replied at once. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, amused. "My dear Watson, you know me better than that. I know you well enough to recognize a trap." "Indeed," he said, "and so does he. That is the point. A simple ambush would insult us both." Hargreaves spoke hesitantly. "What will you do, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes looked down the empty street, then back toward the darker maze of Whitechapel. "I shall do precisely what he expects," he said, "and something he does not." He set off at once, and we followed, though I could not have said to what destination. After several turns, he halted again, this time before a shuttered public house. He glanced at its sign, then at a nearby alley, and smiled faintly. "Watson," he said, "our man has made one error. He believes himself invisible. He forgets that shadows require light." He turned to Hargreaves. "You will return to the yard. Tell Lestrade only what is necessary. Emphasize the locksmith." "And you?" Hargreaves asked. Holmes drew his collar up and stepped back into the fog. "I shall answer a challenge." For a moment he was there, tall, spare, unmistakable. Then the fog closed in, and Sherlock Holmes was gone, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and the uneasy certainty that somewhere in Whitechapel another door was already being prepared. For a moment I stood irresolute upon the pavement, the fog curling about my boots like a living thing. My mind divided between obedience to Holmes's wishes and the instinct, born of long companionship and hard experience, which refuses to abandon him when danger gathers so openly. Hargreaves lingered beside me, pale and uncertain, but it was clear that Holmes's decision admitted of no argument. He had stepped into the game upon his own terms, and the board was already set. "I shall see you safely to a cab," Hargreaves said at last, as if grateful for any practical duty. "I shall walk," I replied shortly. "There is something I must do first." He hesitated, then nodded, sensing perhaps that I was no longer entirely within his authority. We parted a little way down the street, and I turned back toward the direction Holmes had taken, careful to keep to the deeper shadows and to allow several minutes to pass before I followed. Holmes had taught me well enough that pursuit, to be useful, must never announce itself. Whitechapel seemed altered now, not merely dangerous, but watchful. More than once I had the uneasy impression of movement just beyond the veil of fog, of footsteps that ceased when I paused. Whether these were real or the creations of an overwrought imagination, I cannot say. Yet I felt certain that Holmes's disappearance had not gone unnoticed. At length I saw him again. He stood beneath a flickering lamp at a street corner, his tall figure unmistakable even when partially obscured. Yet there was something different in his carriage, something subtly altered. As he turned, I caught sight of his face and started in spite of myself. The sharp lines were softened. His expression was duller, his eyes less keen. A stain marked his sleeve. His hat was pulled low and battered at the brim. In an instant, I understood. Holmes had shed Sherlock Holmes as a snake sheds its skin. He shuffled rather than walked now, favoring one leg slightly, and muttered to himself with convincing incoherence. To any observer, he would have seemed merely another unfortunate soul drifting through the East End night. I kept my distance, my heart pounding, for I knew that this was the most perilous phase of his art. Disguise, with Holmes, was never mere costume. It was immersion, a deliberate erasure of self which left him vulnerable in ways deduction never did. He turned into a narrow street I did not recognize and halted before a building darker and more forbidding than its neighbors. A faint light burned in an upper window. Holmes looked up, swayed, and then knocked. Once, twice. I crouched behind a stack of crates across the way, scarcely daring to breathe. After a long pause, the door opened. A man stood there, tall and spare, his face hidden in shadow. He looked Holmes over with evident distaste. "You're late," the man said. Holmes hunched his shoulders. "Locks don't open themselves," he muttered hoarsely. The man stepped aside and Holmes was admitted. The door closed softly behind him. Minutes passed. 10, perhaps 15. Each seemed an hour. I strained to catch any sound, a voice, a scuffle, but the street lay hushed, as if holding its breath. At last, a figure emerged from the building. It was not Holmes. This man moved with quiet confidence, his hat pulled down, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. As he passed beneath the lamp, I glimpsed his profile. Composed, intelligent, utterly unremarkable. He did not look about him, nor did he hurry. He vanished into the fog with the ease of one accustomed to remaining unseen. The door opened again, and Holmes came out. Swaying more noticeably now, he leaned against the wall, drew a deep breath, and then straightened, the disguise falling away like a discarded cloak. His eyes were bright, too bright. I stepped forward at once. "Holmes!" He turned, startled for an instant, then smiled faintly. "Watson," he said. I might have known. "You are injured," I said, for I saw now the dark stain spreading beneath his coat. "A scratch," he replied lightly, "and a useful one. Come, we must move." "But the man is already moving," Holmes interrupted, "and exactly where I wish him to go." He allowed me to support him as we walked, though his step grew firmer with each yard. "I've seen him, Watson," he said quietly. "I've spoken with him, and now I know what door that key was meant to open." His grip tightened on my arm. "And if we do not reach it in time," he added, "the shadow over Whitechapel will deepen before it lifts." I pressed him to a doorway while I examined the wound as best I could beneath the inadequate light of the lamp. The blood had already slowed, and when he shrugged my concern aside, I knew from long familiarity that the injury was indeed no more than he claimed. Painful, perhaps, but not disabling. "A thin blade," he said, anticipating my question. More for warning than for killing. He wished to be certain I understood the stakes. "And you do?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Entirely." We moved on at once, though I noticed he chose our route with particular care, avoiding the broader streets and keeping instead to a network of alleys which twisted toward the river. As we walked, he spoke in low, measured tones, each sentence falling into place with that dreadful clarity which always marked the nearing end of a mystery. "The man you saw leave the building," he said, "is not our murderer. He is an intermediary, useful, expendable, and ignorant of the full design. He believes himself a participant in a clever burglary, nothing more." "And the real culprit?" I asked. "Has already gone ahead," Holmes replied, "to prepare the final lock." We came at length to a stretch of derelict warehouses near the water. Their windows were broken, their doors chained or hanging loose, their brickwork scarred by time and neglect. The Thames lay beyond, invisible but present, its smells sharp in the cold air. Holmes stopped before one such building, smaller than the rest, and set back from the street as if deliberately overlooked. "This," he said quietly, "is the door." I followed his gaze. The entrance was unremarkable. A stout wooden door bound with iron, its lock new and shining despite the decay around it. A single lamp above cast just enough light to reveal fresh scratches upon the metal. "The key," I murmured. "Yes," said Holmes. "And what lies beyond it?" He drew from his pocket the iron key taken from the woman's mouth. Even in that dim light, the scratched symbol seemed to leer. "This door was fitted a fortnight ago," he continued, "by order of a charitable trust which purchased the building ostensibly for storage. In fact, it houses records, old ones, property transfers, leases, documents quietly removed from circulation." "And the burglaries?" I asked. "An earlier attempt," Holmes said. 7 years ago he tried to gather the same information piecemeal. He failed, was interrupted, perhaps even imprisoned for another offense. But he remembered. And he waited. A faint sound reached us then, the scrape of metal, deliberate and patient. Someone was working at the lock from the other side of the door. Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. "He is there." "What do we do?" I whispered. Holmes smiled grimly. "We arrive on time." He stepped forward and knocked sharply. The sound echoed in the deserted street. The scraping ceased. "Who is it?" came a voice from within, cultured, calm. "An interested party," Holmes replied. "With the correct key." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "I wondered when you would come." The door opened inward. A man stood before us, lantern in hand, his face now fully revealed. It was intelligent, pale, and marked by an intensity that bordered on obsession. His eyes went at once to the key in Holmes's hand. "You understand at last," the man said. "I understand too well," Holmes replied. "You murdered that woman to force this meeting." The man inclined his head slightly. "She was already dying. I merely chose the moment and the symbol." Behind him I saw shelves lined with ledgers and boxes of papers. "Blackmail," I said involuntarily. "Justice," the man corrected. "These documents name men who ruined lives and walked free. I intended to open every door they hid behind." Holmes stepped closer. "And you would have killed again." The man's eyes flickered. "If necessary." From the far end of the street came the sudden sound of running feet and shouted orders. Holmes exhaled softly. "Your shadow ends here." For a moment, the man seemed to weigh his chances. Then his shoulders sagged, and the lantern slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. As Lestrade's men closed in, Holmes turned to me, the tension already fading from his face. "It is always the same, Watson," he said quietly. "Men mistake exposure for redemption." The fog began at last to lift. Lestrade arrived in a storm of boots and lantern light, his men fanning out with practiced efficiency, their breath steaming in the cold air. The culprit offered no resistance. He stood motionless in the doorway, hands loosely at his sides, his expression neither defiant nor repentant, only weary, as though the long tension which had sustained him had at last been released. "I suppose," he said mildly, as the inspector stepped forward to take him by the arm, "that you will wish to hear it explained." Lestrade grunted. "You'll have ample opportunity for that at the Yard." Holmes intervened with a raised hand. "If you will permit me, Inspector, a few moments now may save you several weeks of confusion later." Lestrade glanced at him, irritation warring with relief. "Very well, Holmes. But be quick." We moved just inside the warehouse, where the lantern light revealed the nature of the hoard which had drawn so much blood and secrecy. Ledgers lay stacked in careful order, their spines marked with dates and addresses. Bundles of deeds, correspondence, and contracts filled the shelves, quiet instruments of ruin, stripped of sentiment but heavy with consequence. "Our friend," Holmes began, "is Mr. Edward Marlowe, formerly a clerk in a firm of solicitors specializing in property transfers in the East End. 7 years ago, he discovered that his employers were systematically acquiring buildings under false pretenses displacing tenants and burying evidence of illegality behind a succession of new locks and altered ownerships. Marlowe inclined his head slightly. They ruined families. They ruined my own. Indeed, said Holmes. You attempted then to retrieve the documents quietly, hence the burglaries. But you lacked access to the central archive, the one door that mattered. You were discovered, dismissed, and forced to abandon the attempt. Marlowe's eyes flickered. I waited. And learned, Holmes continued. Chemistry, locks, the habits of police clerks. You learned, above all, patience. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. And the woman? Holmes's voice hardened. She was once a secretary in that same firm, dying of consumption. She knew where the key was kept and what it opened. You persuaded her to help you, then you ensured her silence. Marlowe looked away. I gave her money, comfort, meaning. You gave her death, Holmes replied coldly. There was a brief silence, broken only by the distant lap of the river against stone. The letters, Lestrade said. Why announce yourself? Holmes answered before Marlowe could speak. Because obscurity protected the guilty as much as it protected him. He needed attention, not from the public but from me. He knew that only one person would recognize the pattern of lime, locks, and symbols and arrive before the police closed the net. Lestrade snorted. And the symbol? A signature, Holmes said, and a reminder. He called it the shadow because it represented what lay behind respectable facades. He wished it seen, but not understood. Marlowe gave a small, bitter smile. You understood. Holmes met his gaze steadily. Enough. The inspector nodded curtly, and the men moved in earnest now, securing the documents, escorting Marlowe away. As he passed me, his eyes held neither hatred nor fear, only exhaustion. Outside, the first pale hint of morning crept into the sky, thinning the fog until the outlines of the river and the warehouses emerged like shapes recalled from a troubled dream. Holmes stood for a moment watching the activity, his face composed, almost distant. You risked your life, I said quietly, when we were at last alone. He shrugged. He never intended to kill me. Dead men do not listen. And yet, I said, he killed. Holmes's gaze followed the retreating figures of the policemen. That is the tragedy of such minds. Watson, they begin by seeking justice and end by appointing themselves its instrument. We walked back toward the main road, the city slowly awakening around us. A costermonger's cart rattled past. Somewhere a window was flung open. Life resumed, indifferent and unstoppable. As we reached a crossing, Holmes paused. The documents will do some good, he said. Several men will answer for their actions. But not her, I replied. No, said Holmes softly. Never her. He turned his collar up against the morning chill and set off once more, already, I suspected, moving on in his thoughts to other puzzles, other shadows, leaving me to record, as best I might, the price that had been paid for a single key and the door it was never meant to open. We returned to Baker Street as the city shook itself fully awake, the fog retreating into gutters and alleys where it belonged. Holmes declined a cab, insisting instead upon the restorative virtues of a brisk walk, though I observed that his step, for all its determination, was not quite so elastic as usual. The wound troubled him more than he would admit, and it was only when we reached our sitting room and the familiar warmth enveloped us that he allowed himself to sink into his chair with a faint sigh. Mrs. Hudson appeared at once, her eyes widening at the state of us. Dr. Watson, sir, Mr. Holmes, whatever have you? A scratch and a long night, Holmes said lightly. Tea, if you please, Mrs. Hudson. And something hot enough to persuade a man that London is, after all, habitable. She bustled off, muttering dire prophecies about East End hours and the foolishness of clever men. Holmes watched her go with a ghost of a smile, then leaned back and closed his eyes. "You are satisfied?" I asked. "With the result, yes," he replied. "With the necessity, no." He opened his eyes and glanced toward the mantelpiece, where the violin lay untouched. "Marlowe believed himself righteous," he continued. "That belief sustained him. It also blinded him. He saw doors and locks everywhere, barriers to be breached. He did not see that some doors, once opened, admit nothing but darkness." "And yet," I said, "those documents will expose crimes that would otherwise have remained hidden." Holmes inclined his head. "True, the world is rarely improved by clean methods alone. Still, one regrets the collateral damage." Mrs. Hudson returned with the tea, and while Holmes drank, color returning slowly to his face. I busied myself with my notebook, anxious to capture the impressions of the night before fatigue dulled them. It was only then that Holmes spoke again, his tone altered, reflective. "There is one point you have not yet asked about, Watson." I looked up. "Which is?" "The key," he said. "Not merely what it opened, but why it was placed where it was." "In the woman's mouth," I said slowly. "To force attention, to horrify." "Yes, but also to silence," Holmes replied. "She carried the means of access, but not the knowledge of how to use it. By killing her and sealing the key within her, Marlowe ensured that no one else could employ it without his guidance. It was control, masquerading as symbolism." He rose and paced the room despite my protest, the familiar restless energy returning. "Control?" he repeated. "That is what united every element of this affair. Locks destroyed to control access, letters sent to control the investigation, even the timing of the murder calculated to provoke without overwhelming." "And you?" I asked quietly. "Were you also meant to be controlled?" Holmes smiled thinly. He believed so. That was his final miscalculation. There was a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, hat in hand, looking more tired than I had ever seen him, but with a certain grim satisfaction in his bearing. "It's done," he said. "Marlowe's confessed. Most of it, anyway. The documents are already causing a stir. There'll be inquiries." Holmes nodded. "And the secretary who suppressed the report?" Lestrade grimaced. "He's been spoken to." Holmes's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Spoken to? How reassuring." Lestrade bristled, then sighed. "You know how it is, Holmes. Still, this time something might stick." "Perhaps," Holmes said. "Justice is like London weather. One learns to be grateful for small improvements." Lestrade took his leave soon after, and the house fell quiet once more. Holmes stood by the window gazing out at Baker Street as if seeing it anew. "You will write this one, Watson?" he said without turning. "I already am," I replied. "Be careful," he said. "Do not make a hero of Marlowe, nor of me." "I shall make a record," I said. "Nothing more." Holmes turned then, his expression softer than it had been in days. "That," he said, "is why I trust you." As evening fell and the city resumed its endless murmuring, Holmes took up his violin at last. The music that followed was low and contemplative, without brilliance or display. A meditation rather than a performance. Listening to it, I found my thoughts returning to Whitechapel, to the woman whose name would scarcely be remembered, to the doors that had been opened too late, and to the long shadows cast by men who believed themselves beyond the reach of light. The case was finished. Yet, as Holmes played on, I could not shake the sense that London itself was an unfinished puzzle, and that somewhere, even now, another key was being forged. The days that followed passed with a deceptive calm, as though London itself wished to forget the brief darkness that had gathered over Whitechapel. Newspapers spoke cautiously of irregularities in certain property holdings, and of an arrest made through the intervention of private assistance. But the more sensational elements, the letters, the symbols, the woman whose death had forced the truth into the open, were already fading into omission. The city has ever been adept at swallowing its own shadows. Holmes read the accounts with mild interest and then set them aside. "Marlowe will be convicted," he said one evening, standing before the fire. "Not for everything, but for enough. The documents will do their work more slowly. Men will resign. Committees will convene. Fortunes will quietly rearrange themselves." "And justice?" I asked. Holmes considered the flames. "Partial, which is the usual kind." He spoke no more of Whitechapel after that, though I knew better than to suppose the case had left him entirely. It was not in his nature to dwell upon guilt or remorse. Yet there are occasions, rare but unmistakable, when the human cost of a problem lingers with him longer than the solution itself. One such occasion came when a letter arrived bearing no return address. Holmes opened it, read a single line, and handed it to me without comment. It was from the hospital. The woman had had a name, after all. She had been buried that morning, quietly, paid for by an anonymous donation. No relatives had come forward. No one, it seemed, had claimed her in life or in death. Holmes took the letter back, folded it carefully, and placed it in his desk. "That," he said, "is the one detail Marlowe could not control." The shadow mark did not appear again. Locks across the East End remained intact. Lime returned to its proper uses, and keys once more served doors rather than messages. Lestrade called twice, once to complain and once, less comfortably, to thank Holmes. Hargreaves was promoted, modestly and without ceremony. Pritchard closed his shop for a week and then reopened, declining thereafter all work that came by way of anonymous boys. Life resumed its accustomed pattern. It was on a quiet afternoon, some weeks later, that I ventured at last to ask the question which had troubled me since that night by the river. "You said," I began, "that Marlowe's final error was believing himself invisible." Holmes looked up from his chemical apparatus. "Did I?" "Yes. Yet he evaded the police for years. He manipulated circumstances with remarkable precision. In the end, he nearly succeeded." Holmes smiled faintly. "Nearly." He set aside his test tube and seated himself opposite me. "Invisibility," he said, "is not achieved by hiding oneself, Watson. It is achieved by understanding where others refuse to look. Marlowe understood systems, records, procedures, complacency. What he did not understand was people." "In what way?" "He believed that intelligence alone grants mastery, that if one knows enough, one may justify anything." Holmes's eyes hardened briefly. He failed to account for conscience, his own or that of others. He mistook silence for absence. "And the letters?" I asked. "Why involve you at all?" "Because," Holmes replied, "in the end he wanted recognition. Even the most meticulous criminal desires a witness capable of appreciating the elegance of his design. That desire is always exploitable." He rose, restless now, and crossed to the window. Outside, Baker Street lay bathed in late sunlight, ordinary and unthreatening. "The irony," he continued, "is that had he trusted the law, even imperfectly, he might have achieved much of what he sought. Instead, he chose control over cooperation, secrecy over exposure. That path leads only one way." "To Whitechapel," I said. Holmes inclined his head. That evening he played the violin again, but the music was different from before. Lighter, though tinged with restraint, like a thought released but not forgotten. I listened, my pen idle at last, and reflected upon the strange economy of his work, how one life might be expended to illuminate the crimes of many, and how even brilliance, when divorced from restraint, casts a shadow as dark as ignorance. When he finished, Holmes set the violin aside and stood. "There will be other cases," he said. "There always are." "And other shadows," I added. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "But not all are cast by villains. Some belonged to the city itself. He extinguished the lamp, and the room fell into twilight. Outside, London breathed, vast and unknowable, its doors closed for the night. Somewhere, keys rested unused, and for the moment, at least, the shadow over Whitechapel had passed.